Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leslie Touzeau, and I am the Organic Policy Manager for Quality Certification Services. And today I'm going to give an overview of the Organic Livestock and Poultry Standards, or OLPS. This is a final rule published by the NOP in the fall of 2023 that clarifies many of the regulatory requirements for NOP-certified organic livestock and poultry management. It's a huge, sweeping rule, and I will not be able to touch on all of the many amendments in today's presentation, so I do encourage you to seek out and read the final rule yourself. However, I will try today to cover some of the highlights and things you should know as an organic livestock producer. Okay, thank you for joining me today. And like I mentioned, I'm going to give a brief overview of what OLPS is, and then I'm going to dive into the specific sections of the rule. And this will include a discussion on livestock care and production practices, non-avian and mammalian living conditions. Then we'll move on to a new section of the rule on livestock transport and slaughter, and then finish off with the biggest change, the new section on avian living conditions. And then at the end, I will provide you with a few additional resources you can use if you have additional questions or need more information. So the Agricultural Marketing Service published the Organic Livestock and Poultry Standards final rule on November 2nd of 2023. And the final rule amends the organic livestock and poultry production requirements by adding some new provisions for livestock handling and transport and slaughter, as well as avian living conditions. And then it also clarifies some existing requirements for livestock care and production practices, as well as non-avian and mammalian living conditions. So those kind of four sections. The effective date of the final rule was January 12th of 2024, and the compliance date by which all certified operations need to be in compliance with the regulations was January 2nd, 2025, so just a few weeks ago. There are some provisions of the rule that have an extended compliance date, and that is January 2nd of 2029, and we'll discuss those provisions a little bit later when we talk about poultry living conditions. So if you completed the full QCS Organic System Plan for livestock in 2024, you likely saw several new questions and new requirements in the documents, and many of those are a direct result of OLPS. So I'm now going to go over with you some of those new requirements for on-farm practices, record keeping, and any information you should provide in your organic system plan. Again, like I mentioned, for a complete overview of all of the new requirements, I highly encourage you to read the final rule in full, because I'm going to spend most of my time here highlighting sections of the rule that are new, though there are still many sections of the livestock standards that have stayed the same. So do remember, it is your responsibility to be familiar with the regulations and to maintain your organic compliance. So let's start with livestock care and production practices. As a result of the revisions from OLPS, the regulations do require livestock producers to describe your preventative healthcare practices in the OSP and to identify and record treatment of individual sick and injured animals. So these records will be examined by QCS inspectors during our on-site inspections, just to make sure your treatments for sick or injured animals are compliant and that you're maintaining records that document those treatments and those injured animals. Next, operations are required to create a plan for controlling parasites and have that in their OSP, including any preventative measures you use to minimize parasite pressures, such as things like pasture management, fecal monitoring, as well as an emergency plan in the event of a parasite outbreak. Also, operations should have a plan for how euthanasia will be performed if it ever becomes necessary. So OLPS specifies the methods of euthanasia that are prohibited, and it does not list methods of euthanasia that are allowed, but it does require operators to use methods that are consistent with the most recent guidelines from the American Veterinary Medical Association. Next, livestock operators must also maintain records for monitoring lameness in your herd or flock and any plans for mitigating and treating that lameness when it does become an issue. And again, this should be described in your OSP, and inspectors will be reviewing those monitoring records during inspection. Okay, Section 205.238 has also been updated to specify when physical alterations for livestock are appropriate and what physical alterations are prohibited. So physical alterations are allowed for identification purposes or for safety for the animal, but they must be done at a young age for the species and performed by a capable, trained individual in a manner that minimizes pain, stress, and suffering for the animal during the procedure. Those alterations need to be documented. Details need to be included in the OSP. Records should be kept on the procedures performed. And then OLPS specifies the physical alterations that are prohibited, and this includes things like debeaking and beak clipping after 10 days of age for poultry, and tail docking, face branding, and waddling of cattle, among other things. There's a whole list in 205.238A of the various prohibited physical alterations. Okay, on to the next section. The OLPS final rule separates the organic regulations for livestock living condition requirements into two distinct sections. So there used to just be 205.239. Now there are two sections. One is for mammalian and non-avian livestock, and this includes things like insects, honeybees, and then there's another section, which we'll talk about in a bit here, for avian species. That's at 205.241. So we're going to talk right now about the mammalian and non-avian living condition requirements. Much of this has stayed the same, but there are some things I want to highlight. So first, OLPS removes the requirement that all ruminant livestock must be able to feed simultaneously. So this now will allow for creep feeding and self-feeding as long as feed is accessible to all livestock at all times, even if they're not necessarily feeding at the same time. Also, living conditions for non-avian livestock must include year-round access for all animals to the outdoors, to shade and shelter, to areas for exercise, to fresh air and direct sunlight, and to clean drinking water. Continuous total confinement is still prohibited, as it always has been, except in certain scenarios when temporary confinement may be allowed. Those scenarios have not really changed from the previous iteration of the regulations, and can be found in 205.239B. There are some additional clarifications on the types of scenarios that would allow for temporary confinement. So you can find those in 205.239B. Livestock also must be provided with shelter, and that shelter must provide appropriate ventilation, clean and dry bedding if it's indoors, and enough space for animals to lie down, turn around, stand up, stretch, and express their normal patterns of behavior within a 24-hour period. Now, there's a new provision at 205.239A11 that further clarifies the use of barns or stall structures for mammalian livestock. And so if livestock are housed for part of the day in compliant stalls, there are specific guidelines for what compliant stalls are. But this must be described in the OSP, and the animals still have to have an opportunity within a 24-hour period to have complete freedom of movement. So take note of that. And then finally, dairy young stock may be housed in individual pens until they complete the weaning process, but they still have to have enough room to turn around and lie down and stretch and groom. And then once weaning is complete, the operation may no longer confine the dairy young stock unless there's a reason permitted for temporary confinement that's described in the OSP. Okay, next, there's a brand new section of the regulations on livestock transport and slaughter at 205.242, and we'll come back to 205.241 in a second. That's our avian living conditions, and that's a pretty big new section that I want to spend some time on. So we're going to skip over that right now just to mention 205.242, which is about livestock transport and slaughter. So for livestock operations that are responsible for the transport of livestock, all that livestock must be clearly identified as organic during transport, and any seriously crippled or non-ambulatory animals may not be transported until their health condition improves, meaning that they're ambulatory again. Also, transportation vehicles or trailers need to be providing seasonally appropriate ventilation and bedding, and that bedding needs to be clean, dry, and comfortable. And then operators must describe in the OSP how organic management and animal welfare will be maintained for any transport that's going to exceed 8 hours. And they also have to include in the OSP an emergency plan and whatever emergency plan they have in place to address possible problems that might arise during transport, like if an animal is injured during transport or if a transport vehicle breaks down, what the plan is to maintain organic management and animal welfare in those situations. So for livestock slaughter operations, operators need to be able to demonstrate in their OSP and to the inspector how they comply with the regulations that are set out in 205, 242. I'm not going to go into the specifics really of 205, 242B and C, which outlines mammalian and avian slaughter respectively, because the regulations lay out pretty straightforward requirements for slaughter facilities. But I will just mention that operations engaging in mammalian slaughter must be in compliance with the Federal Meat Inspection Act, among other things, and those engaging in avian slaughter must be in compliance with the Poultry Products Inspection Act. Okay, so the biggest update in OLPS is a brand new section at 205-241 that establishes the requirements for avian living conditions. And so this includes species like chickens, turkeys, geese, quail, pheasants, and any other bird species that's raised for eggs, meat, or other organic products. 205-241 requires that the livestock producer establish and maintain year-round avian living conditions that accommodate the well-being and the natural behavior of animals suitable to the species, the stage of life, the climate, and the environment. So this includes year-round access to, much like mammalian livestock, it includes year-round access to the outdoors, to shade, to shelter, to exercise areas, to clean drinking water, to direct sunlight, and additionally to materials for dust bathing, and then also adequate space for birds to escape any aggressive behaviors. Then 205.2 now defines indoor space and specifies the type of indoor housing. And so OLPS adds definitions to the regulations for the common types of poultry indoor housing, and they include mobile housing, so a mobile structure that has a solid floor, maybe a perforated floor, something that is moved regularly and opened up to allow birds access to the outdoors during the day. Then there's aviary housing. This is going to be your poultry barn, a fixed structure with multiple tiers or levels. Slatted or mesh floor housing, which would be a fixed structure that has a mesh floor or slats on the floor, and then birds are feeding and perching above a pit or a belt with litter that to collect manure, and then litter covering the remaining solid floor. What they're calling floor litter housing, which would be a fixed structure that is a solid floor with litter. And then any other housing that wouldn't necessarily fit into any one of the descriptions above. So these definitions of indoor housing are now in the regulations, and they are used for things like for calculating indoor stocking density, as well as a few other living requirements. So they really are the basis for kind of some of the requirements that we'll talk about here in a second. So 205-241B is the section that details the indoor space requirements for avian living conditions. And 205-241B requires that indoor space for poultry is large enough to allow for birds to move freely, to stand, to stretch their wings, and engage in natural behaviors. Indoor cages are prohibited. So the OSP should describe the details of that indoor housing, including the type of housing and the number of poultry. So that's the kind of information we want from the operator. 205-241B also requires indoor spaces to have exit areas so that all birds can easily access the outdoors. So producers should, the standard set in the regulations is at least 1 linear foot of exit area space for every 360 birds. And then also in the OSP, describe how you make sure all birds have access to those outdoor areas. Next, poultry producers should be monitoring ammonia levels in the poultry houses and implementing practices to maintain levels below 20 parts per million. Ammonia levels must not ever exceed 25 parts per million, but if they do rise above 20 parts per million, we want to see in the OSP the procedures that you use for monitoring as well as any additional practices you might use to lower ammonia levels if they exceed 20 parts per million. So this whole plan for ammonia monitoring, as well as your monitoring records, should be described in the OSP and available at inspection. As far as indoor lighting goes, producers may provide artificial light for up to 16 continuous hours per day, as long as you also provide at least 8 hours of continuous darkness per day. So, and then you also may not manipulate the light spectrum to increase feed intake or growth rates. Next, specifically in chicken layer housing, perches are required for all layers at a rate of 6 inches of perch space per bird. The exception to this requirement is for aviary housing, which, if you remember the definition of aviary housing, that's a fixed structure with levels. So the idea being that because there is vertical space for the birds to perch, the requirement is 6 inches of perch space for 55% of the flock, which would be 3.3 inches of perch space per bird. Now, perch space can include the rail in front of a nest box, but it cannot include floors in houses with slatted floors. So slatted floor housing, in those situations, there still needs to be the appropriate rate of 6 inches of perch space per bird, and those slatted floors do not count as perch space. So our QSS inspectors will be, when they are on site at inspection, they will be measuring that perch space to assure that those houses are in compliance. Finally, poultry producers also must provide materials for dust bathing and clean, dry litter for birds indoors to make sure that they stay healthy and clean. Okay, so then outdoor poultry space. The regulations have a definition for outdoor space and the types of outdoor spaces that you would commonly see on a poultry operation. So 2052 defines pasture pens as kind of what we think of as chicken tractors, floorless pens that may have full or partial roofing that are moved on a regular basis and provide direct access to soil and vegetation and allow birds to express their natural behavior. So that would be considered something like a mobile chicken tractor or pasture pen would be considered an outdoor space. And then another kind of outdoor space structure would be a shade structure that's not enclosed on the sides, something like 4 posts and a roof could be considered outdoor poultry space. And then as for outdoor requirements, all birds must have easy access to the outdoors, like I mentioned. That's why it's important to have those exit areas in poultry housing, indoor poultry housing. And the access must promote and encourage outside access on a daily basis. In those outdoor spaces, at least 75% need to be soil, so not concrete, but needs to be soil. And the soil should have some vegetative cover that's appropriate to the season and the climate and for the species of livestock. In your OSP, you need to describe how you're managing that vegetation to prevent rodents or other pests, like mowing, how else you're managing the vegetative cover to make sure that's not harboring things like rodents or insects or things that you don't want to see on the operation. So the rule also provides details on the minimum indoor and outdoor space requirements for chickens specifically. This is also known as the stocking density, or the weight or number of animals on a given area or unit of land. So stocking density for chickens can be measured in 2 different ways. So what I'm calling metric 1, this is measuring stocking density in the maximum pounds of bird per square foot. So this requires that you know the live weight of your birds and how many birds, and of course how many birds you have. And metric 2, this is measuring stocking density in a minimum square feet per bird. And this is a simpler calculation because producers don't need to know bird weight, you just need to know the square footage of the space and the number of birds. So a minimum square feet per bird, we'll see in a second what those stocking densities are. This is a simpler calculation, but an operation may use either metric to calculate and report the indoor and the outdoor stocking density for chickens. Either metric works. because there are two different metrics, there may be a situation where one metric measuring pounds of bird per square foot is compliant, while metric 2 is not compliant, and that's okay. Just one of the metrics has to be compliant, meaning it has to meet the minimum area per bird. So the outdoor stocking density is based on type of bird. So it's different for layers, different for pullets, different for broilers, and they are laid out in the regulations. I'm not going to spend a ton of time going through this table. This information is just here for your information, but QCS inspectors will verify the stocking densities of outdoor poultry spaces by measurement during inspection. So please do be sure to report accurate stocking densities in your OSP. And you can see here, excuse me, you can see here on this table that I provided both metrics. So for instance, for layers, the outdoor stocking density is a 2.25 pounds of bird per square foot, or at least 3 square feet per bird, depending on which metric you use. Again, you don't have to calculate both, you just have to calculate one metric, and that metric needs to meet these requirements. For indoor stocking density, this is based on not just the type of bird, but also the type of housing, specifically for layers. And those measurements, those metrics are laid out in the regulations. And again, QCS inspectors will be verifying the stocking densities by measurement during inspection. So again, make sure that you're accurately calculating stocking density, that you're recording that information in the OSP, because we are going to want to verify that the stocking densities that you record and that you report match what we see on farm. Okay, so that was an overview pretty quickly. I know that was a lot of information, but that was an overview on the different sections of the Organic Livestock and Poultry Standards. And I mentioned at the beginning that there were some extended compliance dates for January of 2029. So because of all of the new regulations regarding poultry living conditions, OLPS does stipulate that poultry operations don't need to comply with all of the living condition requirements by January of 2025. Now, these extended compliance dates only apply to operations that are certified before January 2nd of 2025. So if you are seeking certification today, these extended compliance dates don't apply to you, and that means that you do have to be in compliance with all of the regulations that I just discussed. However, if you were certified before January 2nd of 2025 and you are a layer operation, then you do have 4 years to comply with the outdoor stocking density requirements and those requirements for soil and vegetation. So soil and vegetation requirements, remember, this means that the outdoor areas need to be 75% soil and have vegetative cover. So if you operate a layer operation and you were certified before January 2nd of 2025, you have 4 years to come into compliance with these requirements. For broiler operations that were certified before January of 2025, you have 4 years to comply with both the indoor and outdoor stocking density requirements and the soil vegetation requirements. So you have an additional 4 years for indoor requirements as well as outdoor requirements. And then all poultry operations, regardless of bird type, if you were certified before January 2nd of 2025, you have 4 years to comply with the exit area requirements. So all poultry operations need to be in compliance with the requirements of 1 linear foot of exit space per 360 birds by January 2nd, 2029. So those are the only exceptions. However, all the other OLPS regulations regarding transport and slaughter, regarding healthcare and production, those are all now in effect as of January 2nd, 2025. Those are those compliance dates. All operations must now be in compliance with those sections of the regulations. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information pretty quickly thrown at you. My goal was just to give you an idea and hope that maybe you found some interesting things to think about or to look up in my presentation. And I would like to leave you with a few bits of resources to kind of help you make sense of all of the new requirements. So first is the Organic Livestock and Poultry Standards website. This is the AMS website. This has a link to the final rule, as well as a fact sheet about the rule, among other resources. It's a great resource to use if you just want some information about the regulation and how it's written. The other is a QCS document that we put together. You can find it on our website, and it is a table that details the living condition requirements of poultry based on poultry type and housing type. So if you're a poultry producer, it's a helpful table with lots of information. I know this is a small graphic here, but as you can see, it's broke down by poultry type, so layers, broilers and pullets, housing type, and then we have information on the indoor stocking density, the outdoor stocking density, the soil and vegetation requirement, the exit area requirement, the flooring requirement, perch space requirement, and then the percent of birds that can perch simultaneously. So all of this information is there in that table. Again, you can get this on our website. Our inspectors and our reviewers will be using this to evaluate operations going forward. We hope it's a really helpful resource for you all and a helpful tool. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I hope that this was an informative presentation and you got something out of it. I hope I didn't leave you with too many questions, but if I did, certainly please get in touch with me. You can send me an email at leslie@qcsinfo.org, or there is my phone number as well. If you have questions, you can also reach out to your other contacts at QCS. But we're here to help. We're here to help you make sense of these new requirements and help you get that certification. So thanks again and have a wonderful day.